All right, welcome to the Spencer Leonard Hour. It is always special when Spencer shows up, which is why I ran the intro for the Sublation special. Um,
My
this
teachers
week,
always said that I was special, and
yeah,
that's
my
right as they were tightening up, you know, the uh, the restraint jacket.
you're right. I had a lot of my peers call me special, although not 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 with that term. But anyhow, yeah. Well, Spencer, I'm always glad to talk to you. This is a time. It seems like every time, but is this way. But right now, after the assassination of Charlie Kirk, I feel like I need an intervention. Actually, I've been spending more time on X, you
Uh-oh.
know, in this obsessive way.
Yep.
Um, I've been allowing myself to follow the imaginative stories coming out of the Walter Kearns keyboard,
Okay.
um, and and uh, and I've been disappointed about what I've been seeing there. But I worry about my own possible regression right now, and
Hmm.
so I wanted to start by asking you what is uh, what is regression? What does it mean when a Marxist or someone who's a critical theorist in the Frankfurt School tradition, or someone who's studied that tradition, when they refer to societal regression, what are they talking about?
Well, they could be. I mean, if you're talking about societally, um, which in some sense is driving a wider ideological regression, um, you're talking about capitalism, and it's how capitalism isn't really a thing. It's more like a crisis. It is a crisis. I mean, a lot of people on the left tend to think of capitalism as like a form of society. Really, what it is it's a crisis of bourgeois society. And so, there are lots of symptoms of it that, the basic ones, are just what, you know, any. And so a lot of people, social theorists would talk in a lot of different ways. You get liberals talking about it, um, like a liberal sociologist like Emil Durkheim would talk about like anomie, and he would point to things like mental illness or, um, nationalism, or he wrote a lot about it in the context of the rise of anti-Semitism in France during the time of the Dreyfus affair. Not of course, simply because he was a French Jew, but he was a French Jew, and he was keenly aware of what was going on in terms of the ideological effects of or the symptoms of the crisis of society. So you can understand that crisis of society in a lot of different ways. It doesn't have to be like in a Marxist way, but I think liberals have difficulty, and I think Durkheim had difficulty coming to terms with it. The way Marxists would think about it is that this society's innermost um, character, its social relations, its form of cooperation, its form of freedom, is contradictory with itself.
Mm-hmm.
So when society attempts to reconstitute itself, it also disintegrates. Now, we live in capitalism, poses the problem, or most acutely at the level of politics. It's the crisis expresses itself politically, as it were, inherently. Not, I don't mean to be ontological about it. I'm just saying it's characteristic. So it generates mass politics. It generates universal suffrage democracy and mass politics, and it requires, as it were, um, an adequate politics to recognize itself And so that can't, in itself, it can't prevent the regression. It doesn't stop the regression. But we live in a world in which not only is there, as it were, regression, but there's also no adequate registration of it and adequate political response to it. And so, we might think of regression after Marxism as different than the regression that Marx and Engels and the great Marxists, Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin, Kautsky, Trotsky, these people, that they also recognized. So in the same way, we might talk about Bonapartism as being, in a sense, less recognizable or naturalized in our world because there's no alternative to it. The alternative to it, of course, isn't anti-Bonapartism, as some people on the left seem to think, but rather critical Bonapartism, a politics of the socialist working class that attempts to work through the problem of Bonapartism. And that's the whole question of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is obviously off the table and has been for a very long time. And so regression is, the right has ways of talking about it too. They can talk about decadence. The left tends not to speak of decadence. So, but I'm fine with it, whatever. There are a lot of ways that people understand that, we may not be capable, we may not be adequate to bourgeois society even as we're in it. Like a great example would be like gun control. We may actually need gun control, but only because like people are obviously crazy. The founding fathers, good bourgeois intellectuals, Enlightenment intellectuals, they took for granted that people could be like respectful and they could be polite and they could be civil in debate, and they weren't going to run around like killing each other because they perceived people who differed in their opinions differently, or they felt that they needed to be killed. Instead it was, they just assumed, well, that the government might engage in tyranny, in which case the people would have to defend themselves. But they'd be fully capable of doing that. They'd be able to mount a project, as of course the American revolutionaries did, and respond to that tyranny responsibly without just everything dissolving into anarchy. There was a lot of anarchy in the American Revolution in the negative sense of lawlessness. But now, can we trust other people to have the right to bear arms? Right? And so, these things that, of course, I've spoken about this publicly before. Socialists, of course, would have defended the right to bear arms. Of course they would have. They would have felt that the working class needed to be able to defend itself, both from the state and from the hired thugs, Pinkertons, etc., of the capitalists. And now, we have these regressive categories of like safety. I was teaching this morning, and we were talking about the internet, and the students said that the internet makes things more safe because their mothers can always know where they are. They have like location apps. And and I said, of course my Gen X self just immediately recoiled from that, and I said safety is overrated. It's important to be unsupervised when you're young, right? So you can develop like a responsible morality and be an adult, like
Mhm.
learn to settle disputes amongst yourselves, right? Don't refer things to your parents, don't narc, right? Like an idea like that, like don't narc. Like the other side of that was you have to make sure that your friends aren't out of hand and breaking the law or doing horrible things, right? You don't, and so I think that, we are living in an age where, obviously there's a collapse of institutions, there's a crisis of institutions, and of course there's a crisis of psychology that goes with that.
Well, I want to point out another regression that I've noticed and get your opinion about it. And then this is my usual look. I'm wearing my so-called journalist shirt. And what I've noticed is that when we try to speak to the social crisis or the crisis that is capitalism, the way that we go about framing the discussion, the initial questions we ask, the way in which we think about things is too closed and kind of ready-made for us from the start. So a really obvious example was after the assassination of Charlie Kirk on X, the debate was whether or not the shooter was Antifa left-winger or a groiper, which is this, I don't, I'm barely aware of groipers, but I've been made to be aware of it several times. And
Is it something other than just a follower of Nick Fuentes?
No, it's just a follower of Nick Fuentes. Yeah. I mean, but that's like saying, is it something, I think it may be like saying, is it something other than a follower of Gavin McInnes? Because Gavin McInnes started the Proud Boys.
Right.
So there is some sort of, or is it something other than being a follower of Charlie Kirk? Because Charlie Kirk started Turning Point USA. So there is some sort of organization, an institution around Nick Fuentes, I think, but I don't know the full character of it. And it may not be much more than a fandom. I don't know. But the question was this: was he a groiper or was he Antifa? Rather than who was he? Why did it happen? What's the context in which this is happening? Can we think about what happened 2 weeks ago, or a month ago, or 10 years ago, or 50 years ago, to try to understand this moment,
right,
or 100 years ago? Like, what certainly it would seem to me be worthwhile to think about what happened 10 to 15 years ago, which I tried to do when I talked to Wyatt Verlin. But yeah, so I'm noticing that we are not very open to being curious about events and wanting to know why and how they happened, but rather we are moving, like I said, ready-made pieces around a board that's been laid out for us, it seems like. And when you talk about the question of safety and gun control, that seems possibly inappropriate in this moment to even be bringing up, because it may not be that this would have gone particularly differently if there had been more gun control.
Well,
right?
There's that. Yeah.
I mean, because they're right now the FBI is saying there was some coordination with some organizations which have they're saying some ties to the State Department. So
ties to the State Department.
Right. Right. Not direct ties, but nonetheless ties through funding mechanisms. So like, right, we live in a world where the state bureaucracy has been pushed out into these NGOs, and there's a lot of plausible deniability around what goes on. A good example would be the way in which the Democrats led protests against Elon Musk and Tesla, and a lot of different organizations participated in that overall effort, and that included acts of vandalism and arson and things like that. to and there was enough plausible deniability that the arson could take place as a part of the overall effort without it actually being directly tied to the center.
I mean,
of
it seems to me that there's, it's pretty dark, the attempts to link Tyler Robinson to any shooter, because they really seem to be addressing like a kind of climate, or like a body of ideas, or an activism, rather than any criminal conspiracy. At the level of the criminal act that was committed in Utah, it seems like a pretty straightforward murder. I mean, at least from what they say, if you take at face value the reported facts of this case, it seems like even his roommate lover was shocked that Tyler Robinson committed this act. It seems like he informed him after the fact, and that the roommate himself was dismayed to hear it. To your larger point of like the lack of curiosity,
Mm-hmm.
We get it in, I don't know what, I feel like nowadays, like maybe even like the public representations and like, kitsch television, this sort of thing, it's even degraded. So it's either in a sense pro cop or anti cop, like it's like Chicago PD or something. There's nothing sort of things that like, we had like, I don't know what, Law and Order, where, there's a crime and it's investigated and everybody's interested, right? The audience isn't like pre-selected. It's not like Law and Order is not for like Republicans or Democrats, right? And of course the interest in crime is, pretty obvious, right? It's a violation of social practices. It's a crime against society. It's a damage to society. Any murder is a damage to society. Crime. That's really how we understand it. And the position that something like Law and Order puts you in, or presupposes, is one of, in a sense, curious independence.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know that Law and Order has gone woke or whatever in its 22nd season,
Mm-hmm.
which itself is like a revival. I think a Biden era revival, and very unfortunate.
Mm-hmm.
Where like they put like the white detective and the black detective together, and the black detective sees things that the white detective doesn't because of his white skin privilege or whatever absurdity. Right. But, the overarching question is, the way that, even as our politics gets more and more degraded and less interesting, the Republican Party, to a large degree, the crisis has played itself out there, though we can talk about, there is a crisis, there is an argument over the way it's responding to the Charlie Kirk killing. Certainly, in the Democratic Party, the stakes are much lower. Like, it's absolute, not that there were stakes in 2016. I certainly mistrusted Bernie Sanders from the beginning, and I lamented the fact that young people were going to resolve their impulse towards leftism by, via the Sanders campaign.
Mm-hmm.
But it was nevertheless, a interesting phenomenon to see the crisis within the political parties play out.
Mm-hmm.
You could learn a lot from that about the nature of society and the politics that it generates. Now, one just finds, the news cycle less interesting. At the same time, people are more identified, seemingly, with their tribe or with their team. the independence that in some sense was expressed by, like, the old language of like the horseshoe, like Sanders and Trump. There's a place where people are meeting, and that's the place of the crisis with the two parties as they exist. There was something interesting to be observed there. Now that doesn't seem to be the case. Rather, like, if you're Team Trump, like, I have absolutely nothing to do with you, and if you're a fascist or you're a libtard, like, that's just it. And at this, so the deeper phenomenon, no matter how, like, loud it seems on X, it seems to me, the underlying phenomenon is depoliticization.
I want to ask you a question about TV.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember the show Barney Miller? I mean, I'm going to make myself seem old. I know I am.
This
old,
sounds like something out of the 70s or something.
You don't remember Barney Miller?
No.
Barney Miller was starred
I wasn't as keyed into the zeitgeist as you were.
Barney Miller was a show in the 70s, yeah, and it was it started in 1975, and it was on syndication a lot through into the 80s as well. Here, I'll show you.
I'm looking. Oh, okay. I remember Barney Miller. Yes, I remember Barney Miller.
Wow, it was.
The black guy with the fro. What was his name?
Yeah, I don't remember the actor's name. Here, I'm going to show you the. Here, we'll just see if I can add this to the screen. Here we go. Okay, let's see. Do you hear that?
How old are you, Doug? You must be like 60 years old.
I'm your age. I'm exactly your age.
I was not watching TV in 1975.
Neither was I, but like I said,
except on Saturday mornings.
This was in syndication for years. Like and it actually lasted longer than 19. It wasn't just one season. It was on for quite a long time. And this went into the early 80s and then was repeated again and again. You could watch it kind of like MASH. It was a little bit like MASH. It was everywhere. So anyhow, at least that's my memory of it. The reason I bring up Barney Miller was because it was a comedy about a police precinct. And it in the spirit of All in the Family, maybe a lot of social problems would be introduced into the precinct, and each cop would kind of represent a different perspective on it. There was the guy who was in the karate uniform had been a hippie and even maybe involved with SDS.
Right.
And so everything was mixed together within the police force. And the cops weren't corrupt, but they were certainly human. There were things went badly. But in a comedic way. Anyway,
I mean, I think the old TV, even though it was, as the kids say, monoculture, in many ways, it engaged with society more deeply. Whether it was WKRP in Cincinnati or MASH or Hill Street Blues. These older shows, obviously the police shows, they showed society much more realistically, right? Like Hill Street Blues, like it just showed the fact that the street gangs are being managed by the police, right? Like the heads of the street gangs would regularly come in and talk to the police chief, and because they were needed to keep the peace. They were part of maintaining order. You couldn't just say, oh, these are criminal elements. These are just constitutive parts of society in a way that you just can't imagine a TV show like showing that.
Right.
Nowadays.
Everything is kept much more distinct. The fact that we're kind of all in it together, and that the cop and the criminal aren't as different as they seem. They're both living in New York. They're both having to deal with the subway, for instance. That might be a conversation that you would hear on Barney Miller, between a guy who was a flasher and the cop. Is like, how did you how did you have the courage to go down there without your clothes on, given all the crime down in the subway system? He's like, I don't know. I felt compelled. Something like that would be a conversation on Barney Miller.
Right.
Anyhow, so the point that you just made is an important one, because that's what I want to bring up, basically, is that this distinction between the apparatus that's meant to be investigating and doing something about society's dysfunction and crisis, and the society itself is mostly an artificial one. These institutions of management or policing are within society and of society, and society is of the police now, and that's a troubling thing for us to realize. And I think that our own thoughts are being managed and policed. When you have that kind of dichotomy on offer as a way to understand a political assassination, a kind of understanding that falls far below Hill Street Blues, which was from the boob tube, right? What is the vast wasteland? Was Barney Miller and Beverly Hillbillies and Hill Street Blues. It was not the golden age of TV back then, but yet still,
right. I mean, I don't trust, obviously, these are pretty crude symptoms, talking about television, but this obviously film is, like, I don't want to sound like a grumpy old man. I mean, I just want to say that, the ability of society, the ability of people to like step out of, their talking points and their filter bubbles. I mean, I think a lot of people like blame these things on the internet. I think the internet is, really reproducing social life, or it's a projection out of social life as much as it's creating it. I mean, of course, social life is taking place on the internet to a greater degree. But I think that, for instance, young people in high school choose their friend groups on the basis of like politics and opinions, and not being challenged, being reinforced in your opinions in a way that, I just wasn't that way when I was younger. I didn't, I was concerned more about, the character of people and, the fun that I could have with them and the things I could learn from them and the things I could do with them. More than just, like, are they going to reinforce my views? In other words, I had a lot of conservative friends, and I had friends that, didn't, who studied, whatever, engineering or sciences or business, things that I didn't study, et cetera. I think that, we had shared interests, music, partying, hanging out, which seemed distant, from like the question of what their attitudes were about this or that social question. And of course, it was understood that, I was learning from people and that I was changing as a result of my relationships with different people. Right. So, I didn't, and of course I felt the same way about other people. I didn't take them to be fixed in their beliefs or what they are. So for instance, we had a conversation about, I'll just put it in terms of like our own conversations. We had a conversation about Marxist historians. And I don't mean to call anybody out, but somebody in the comments said, isn't it easy? Because I was, of course, saying, I'm not so sure that there's such a thing as Marxist history writing.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I'm sure that there isn't. In the sense that there's something about the way history's written.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And one of the comments was, isn't Marxist history written by Marxists? And I'm just like, well, what is a Marxist if not the author of book? Like if you're talking about Marxist intellectuals, if you can't see it in the book that they write, then what on earth are we talking about? Like, I'm not sure that anyone, quote, is something or other.
Right.
A liberal, a Marxist, right? Their intellectual production might, what they produce might be Marxist, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if the history book that they write is not Marxist, then what on earth does it mean to say that they're a Marxist historian, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're just saying they're a historian who happens to be a Marxist in some other domain of I don't know what. He organizes socialist workers or something. He gives lectures, to socialist meetings. So you don't think of people as like one thing, and you don't think of them as static or fixed, but rather people who are subject to persuasion, people who are persuading you, people that you're relating to and interacting with. And I think that there's some kind of crisis there. That in some ways is kind of is difficult for me to wrap my mind around. Like what does a relationship mean?
Right.
To people, right? What does it mean? To like, I know you're in a relationship. You've been married. I'm sure your marriage was, a success as much as it was a failure, or a success before it was a failure. And these things are never unambiguous, right? But like, I talk to Chris about these things. Of course, we talk about our married lives, right? It's how would I possibly know what it is to be married apart from my relationship with my wife?
Right.
That just means nothing apart from my relationship with her.
You could read a sociology book or an anthropology book, right?
I could see the lives of other married people. I could read novels about married people. I could see movies about married people. But ultimately, my experience of it's going to be is going to be determinate. Like all my experience will be. And yet that determinacy is precisely where freedom is sparking off, right? It's precisely where the open-endedness is. And of course, the films and the novels and everything's helped me to reflect upon my experience. They're not ancillary to it. But, I think that the crisis of society that we're in now, is that, that we're seeing with these kind of responses to the Charlie Kirk killing. Ultimately, like, I said to my students, Charlie Kirk could have ended up a socialist. Right?
He might have. Yeah.
He might have. Like, it's more common that people go from being conservative, go from being leftists to being conservative in the 20th century. But, that's not always the way it was.
No, and I've known people who go from being conservative to being socialist, plenty of them.
Right.
And the question around Charlie Kirk becoming a socialist would probably come down to how successful a socialist movement became, more than it just would be a matter of his personal,
of course,
trajectory. But the
but the idea that, if you say to young people, maybe you killed like a leftist comrade.
Oh, right.
In the making.
Right.
Like, because they don't think, ultimately, as socialists, the point would be like, look, we have to get society as a whole to a whole other place. It's not that like this team needs to beat that team.
Well, this is the main thing, right? I mean, this is the primary problem right now. And I don't understand how anyone who has called themselves a socialist in the last 10 years could be holding on to this perspective. But the team, the partisan character of the left should give everyone on the left who calls themselves socialist a pause and make them re-examine their priorities, because the trying to decide whether the shooter was Antifa or Groyper, and then entering into debates about whether Democrats or Republicans have been responsible for more political violence. It just completely misses the point of trying to alter and to move society. It's saying it insists that there is a part of capitalist politics that works, and that the task is to rid ourselves of the part of capitalist politics that does not work. And then and that kind of thinking, I think, actually makes questions like the political assassination of Charlie Kirk merely a question of ends, means and ends. So does this means undermine your ends, right? Rather than, which I guess isn't the worst way to think about it, but it assumes that the ends are already on hand, and that therefore it kind of, I think, justifies any kind of means to achieve it, rather than think about the means and ends as connected. Meaning how we go about it will determine what we get.
Well, the other thing I would point out, you were talking about like the lack of a kind of let's say follow the evidence curiosity about the shooter.
Mm-hmm.
I find it remarkable that people don't talk about the specificity of the event. To me, as an educator, as a college professor, and also as a member of an organization that specifically organizes on college campuses, college and university campuses.
Mm-hmm.
I think like a political event like inviting violence that's on national television and that grips the whole culture, this is going to be terrible for the university and for colleges and for educating young people, right? And like, how can you hold political meetings where you're discussing hard ideas, and like, obviously Platypus doesn't do debates.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a limited value, I think, to that. But, we assume that there's a wider, or we have to assume that there's a wider open university environment.
Mm-hmm.
If the university administrators just become preoccupied with safety and like keeping their campus out of the news, then they are going to gut the ability of students to organize anything. And it's just going to be, since authorized student groups doing authorized activities,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's it. It's
that's what it is now, right? I mean,
Muslim Students Association doing, an Eid dinner or something, which I've got no problem with that. I've got no problem with such things, but that's all that the administrators will allow. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, well, right now we already are there, because,
oh yeah,
Platypus itself is a student organization which is authorized. on many campuses to hold these kinds of events. And you have to get that kind of authorization. What you're saying is,
And it's extremely hard to get it a lot of times.
Yeah,
a lot of universities, the administration just makes it very difficult, and perhaps more difficult in some environments rather than others. More difficult, for instance, it's been difficult in England.
Mm-hmm. Oh well,
it's difficult in a lot of Southern university campuses. Having like a student publication, like we've had, there've been universities where you can't distribute your own publication for free, or you can't put a flyer. I mean, you can't put a flyer on a billboard, on a signboard in the hallways of universities anymore without it having a stamp from the administration. So there's just a real,
I think you had to get
chill.
permission to use that. There might have been one bulletin board that was open to any student to use when I was at Portland State, but I think there were some places where
there must have been billboards where they were like putting up like this band is playing at this club.
Yeah, there were. Well, and also
outside people from outside the university,
if you wanted it on a billboard inside the student building or the buildings, then you would there might have been one place where you could do that, and then you'd have to get authorization for the others. But then, of course, all around there were flag poles and telephone poles and trees and what have you, where you would post these things, and boards, and cafes and all that kind of thing, where you would have an ability to do that. But anyhow,
I'm talking about flyers that say like, "Hey, we're going to watch, whatever, the young Karl Marx film, in room this thus and such in this hall at 7 p.m." Or just obvious that this is already authorized,
right?
Or you couldn't have gotten the room,
right? If you have the room, then you certainly have the right to put up a flyer, don't you?
Not necessarily, right?
Oh my God!
So it's a crazy time, right? And it's been definitely degrading for a while, as you say.
Mm-hmm.
And our experience is definitely very different for a lot of reasons. They get can you get put on like a university online calendar of events, right, for student organizations? Because of course a lot of things are digital now.
That's going to get much more difficult after the assassination of Charlie Kirk. It's going to be even worse for sure, right?
I mean, I hope not. Obviously, the results of this are, or the consequences of this killing are not fixed. They are, subject to all sorts of contestation and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that it's clear that the Trump administration and the combination of the defensiveness of Democrats that run so many institutions and their, in a sense, siege mentality, together with Pam Bondi running around talking about hate speech, and the federal, the jackbooted thugs in Washington, looking for the Democrat equivalent to domestic terrorism. Obviously Biden did this in a big way, turning January 6th into a witch hunt of every organization in America and infiltrating them and so forth, and talking about, what was this, dark MAGA?
Mm-hmm. Dark Brandon, wasn't it?
No. Well, there was the Dark Brandon speech, right? That was about, basically criminalizing, like, whatever,
right?
MAGA Republicans, right? The way that MAGA Republican was thrown around by Democrats as though these people were beyond the pale.
Well, yeah. I mean, what I'm noticing is that they're coming out of Kash Patel and Luna, what's her name?
Laura Loomer.
No, not Laura Loomer. The congressperson.
Oh, I forget. Right. Who's
Bruno.
doing the JFK revelations?
Right. And now she's also said that I believe that there are some ties between these activist groups, which are funded in an indirect way out of the State Department. That look, COINTELPRO infiltrated left organizations and encouraged acts of violence, inflamed the organizations, led them in a direction where they would be more likely to undermine their own activity and end up wrangling with the police and maybe committing crimes. That's one of the things that COINTELPRO did. When you have...
They were taking advantage, it should be said, of disorganization and crisis.
Right. Yes. Right. That happened, though. And then, since then, we've got the left totally or almost totally professionalized through NGOs and nonprofits, right? And those, and down to the level of
I wouldn't call those the left. Yeah, Democrats.
well,
Sure.
Democrats, but the distinction starts to evaporate when you have these young people who consider themselves Marxists or Maoists fighting for trans rights in a group called armed queers, but they're getting money indirectly through a network of NGOs and nonprofits that does get state money. So the infiltration now is like institutionalized. COINTELPRO has sort of been institutionalized, I think, since the 60s, despite the church committee. And we are this is what I'm speculating about. I can't prove all of this, but this seems to me to follow naturally. So since the COINTELPRO, the infiltration of the left and the integration of the left into the Democratic Party has taken place, now political violence that's taking place on the left is possibly going to be tied to factions within the bureaucratic state. And so when it gets reduced to the level of, oh, this is about hate speech or stochastic terrorism or so on and so forth, that depoliticizes it and avoids what I think would be a proper demand from society, which would be transparency, reform, reinstating some of the norms from the church committee, which should be, and whether or not the state actors are Democratic Party actors or left or right wing, that should be the demand in this moment. And so anyway, I would want us to follow up and watch just what is coming out of these investigations, what the quality of evidence is that's being presented. And
I mean, I would say that, I guess I would say to a degree, we can't be distracted by this.
Right. Okay. This is why I wanted to talk to you about my own possible regression, because this is what's going on in my mind, right? Which comes out of the Twitter files and
I mean,
right.
we can't, first of all, we can't posit some time when capitalism, wasn't statefying society. Right. I mean, this is capitalism. Whether Marx is talking about, the recruitment of the police from the scum of society and how, there's a thin line between the thugs and, sort of yahoos that are bringing Louis Bonaparte to power, the Society of December the 10th, that the state rises out of the scum and of society. That's what Marx means. He means the bodies of armed men, are in some sense, and this gets to the relationship of the police to criminals and so forth. Or we're talking about the breakdown of private property and sending factory inspectors. In Das Kapital, Marx talks about how class struggle itself, precipitates the entrance into the site of production of factory inspectors who are, trying to enforce the 10 hours bill and so forth, right? And so there's a statification of the relationship of the employers and the employed, of capitalists and workers,
Mm-hmm.
right? This is the condition of capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
And we see it in just every way, right? Like obviously the complete abolition of private property in the labor market,
Mm-hmm.
which is managed by the state in 1,000 ways. It's managed through immigration law. It's managed through
Labor law.
minimum wage laws. It's managed through, occupational health and safety laws. It's managed through, anti-discrimination laws. It's managed in innumerable ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say that, and that's been true. That was true like before the church committee, after the church committee. It's true now. Obviously, it can be better and worse. It can be greater and less, and it can also be new in disturbing ways. It doesn't always, it's not historically invariant. It takes on new forms. I would say that, obviously at the end of the day, it doesn't really affect the task of building socialism. If we were obviously the campaign is in a kind of a pre-political moment,
Mm-hmm.
right? But if you were to make propaganda about this stuff, the point would be, just say look, both of these, all of these capitalist parties, right? They don't uphold bourgeois norms.
Right.
Right. They claim to, right? But, in the face of the people talking to each other, they say, well, there's free speech and there's hate speech. I listened to this jackass on, he's one of the editors of Reason magazine. He's a card carrying libertarian.
Yeah.
Michael Moynihan.
Mm-hmm.
And he appears on Megyn Kelly's show.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, well, I've got a lot of friends, who envy America for its free speech laws, and I'm very proud of America's free speech laws. But then he goes on to say, the First Amendment is here, I'm paraphrasing, it's here to defend the rights of the kooks and the crazies, not you and me, but the kooks and the crazies. And I thought, that's where you see the conservatives reveal themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
They don't actually think that they need the First Amendment, because they're never going to say anything that challenges the status quo. They don't imagine themselves to truly be in a minority where all they have is their rights.
Mm-hmm.
They assume that they have an army of people who are going to defend them, who are engaged in capitalist politics like them, for whom their opinions are reasonable, in the face of attack. Right. But you and I, right? We need our rights. Right. In the face of the Department of Justice running around and searching for terrorists on the left, of course they're going to be, well, look at these Marxists here, right? Or whatever. As I've always known, it's a very important thing to understand, and this is the difference between me and the DSA, right? Or, whoever it is, Bhaskar Sankara or Ben Burgess or Matt McManus. I don't think I'm an election away or a vibe shift away from being in power. right? I know I'm not going to be in power like any time in my, probably in my lifetime, certainly no time soon,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because, my politics are absolutely in the wilderness. They just, and they're in the wilderness that we call history. They're 100 years ago and more.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, I'm obviously independent.
I want to agree with you everything you just said, and then also say the opposite is sort of true. Meaning, you could see over the last 5 years since Biden was elected that it became necessary for one of the capitalist parties to take up the First Amendment as something that they needed
Oh, yeah.
politically. And certainly the libertarians, but regardless of what that guy said, the actual Libertarian Party needs the First Amendment, or at least thinks it does, because spends a lot of time protecting it. So even for capitalist politics, there's the First Amendment and free speech is always being contested, and it's good that we have more than one party, so that contestation continues, because it actually benefits you and I when
Indeed.
one of the parties decides that they need to defend our rights for them,
Sure.
out of their own interest.
Right. I mean, obviously, Chris will just like quote Fox News,
Mm-hmm.
on the Catrone Zone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was listening to Laura Ingraham,
Mm-hmm.
or I was listening to Hannity, right? And it must drive a lot of your listeners around the bend, right?
Yeah.
But, obviously, like oppositional democratic politics is a good thing. And the party in opposition to the other party is going to say a lot of true things about them.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right.
The Republicans are going to make all the liberal criticisms, or a lot of the liberal criticisms of the Democrats. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, by liberal, I mean, deriving from the Constitution, from the American Revolution, from the Enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, here in America, we live in the First Republic. We live in the republic that was established by the 18th century revolution and is in, continuous operation with a brief, whatever hiccup that we'll call the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
But everybody knows, every American knows that, the right side won the Civil War, and it transformed our Constitution. And,
Mm-hmm.
even the South is in favor of the Union, because it gave us, it preserved the Republic. So, we have the benefit of, like, basically our two parties both stand on the ground of the American Revolution, by which I mean, including, its ongoing life, most obviously the Civil War, as a kind of renewal and extension of that revolution. And so the opposition, will point out useful things. Like, obviously, like, people are going, a lot of Democrats are going to criticize Pam Bondi for talking about hate speech,
Right. Which is good. We should encourage them to criticize Pam Bondi.
Of course we should.
Absolutely.
I mean, it so happens that a lot of Republicans are going to make that criticism, but, Republicans are pretty quiet about, ICE raids, about which there are a lot of criticisms to make. Do we really want to have law enforcement that doesn't require to wear a uniform in public? Is everything, does the question of the safety of the officers just trump every other consideration? Shouldn't people have to identify themselves? Shouldn't, if you're taking someone and putting them in a car, shouldn't the car be marked as law enforcement?
Did you notice, though, when we were watching Barney Miller, most of those guys weren't in cop uniforms. They were detectives, so they didn't wear the uniform. They weren't the beat cops. So it's been a long time.
But they show their badges,
Yeah, they
hello,
do show their
ma'am,
badges.
and they show their badges.
Yeah, they do that.
Yeah.
So you at least have to show your badge. But yeah,
these ICE agents don't show a badge.
I know
it's unbelievable.
Why wouldn't they? What's the point in not doing that? It would get more cooperation if they did, wouldn't it? Wouldn't you think?
They're not interested. I don't think they're interested in cooperation. I think they're interested in being menacing. I think they're interested in, exerting an extreme form of state power. Yeah, the plain fact of the matter is you cannot deport legally. Like, we cannot have the political norms that we take for granted if we're going to deport people on such a scale. Right? It's just, you can't, you're just going to institute a regime in which people carry their papers. Right? And once you can,
and they're already making that the real ID. That's what that is, right? That's happening. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I just want to point out that there's another side to the Trump administration from the ICE age, from the ICE raids, and
the Trump administration has existed since the Ice Age.
It seems like it.
It will exist forever. All of human history is building up towards the Trump administration. Right.
No.
Even before humans, right? The mastodon. Let's be good Hegelians here.
That's not what I meant to say. That was a Freudian slip. The other side of the Trump administration is he's contesting who has authority over the executive and trying to take control of the intelligence community, the executive bureaucracy. And we should remember that as we watch Kash Patel investigate the assassination of Charlie Kirk, because that is another thing that is happening here, I believe, is that it is a way, because one of the other connections is possibly through USAID to this organization of armed queers. So the point is all these things are kind of connected, and it's not always clear, what is motivating the Republicans or the Democrats in any given moment. Like, I'm not against cleaning house in the executive branch, but we should be, like I said, we should watch this very carefully, because there are going to be things that are exposed that neither party really wants to emphasize. What they would much rather debate is whether or not hate speech laws are necessary, rather than what has been the history of infiltration of these organizations by the state, or to what degree is what seems like organic violence actually perpetuated much more directly, or at least in a way that it might amount to negligence. Right.
I mean, obviously, like, I brought up guns an hour ago. I don't know what they do, but you mentioned this organization, Armed Queers. There is an assumption that somehow, not everyone's going to avail themselves of the right of self-defense, right? And so, when you raise like socialist gun clubs, or you raise, women's self-defense, or you raise, queers, armed queers. If what Armed Queers does is just take people, who identify as queer or whatever, to the gun range and teach them how to safely use a gun, I'm all for it. I'm all for people, who maybe some people, don't think of as your typical member of the NRA, availing themselves of their rights under the Constitution. Even if even if there's a correlation between certain kinds of gender dysphoria and other mental health issues, right?
Yeah.
Or whatever, right? Like when
Mhm.
you start talking about like, well, we're going to start adjudicating people's mental health, right? This is what I mean by saying like, this is just not the society that like the Constitution was written for.
Mhm.
Right? We obviously do have a lot of people who shouldn't have guns, but at the level of right, I'm not comfortable with the state actually adjudicating that.
No, me
and
neither. I'm for protecting the Second Amendment, and
as
I
soon
have
as
no
you say
trouble.
that means like crazy people,
It does include them, but I also recall, and I don't know the full background story, but I listen. When my oldest was in university at University of Oregon, there was he started a socialist group there, and he had to relate to the student body, to student council and some other student organizations. And one of the big student organizations that he dealt with came out of the Men's Center, which was actually not like men's rights, but more like an adjacent to the Women's Center, like bringing feminism to men, that kind of thing.
I
I
see.
think University of Oregon, and it was also very much about dividing people up by racial categories. And so at the Men's Center, there was an organization for brown people, and I forget the name of it, but this guy had some bureaucratic authority in the Men's Center representing brown people on campus. And he ended up, after he left university, I don't know if he graduated, joining a group to arm uh, 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 brown socialists, like
Sure.
against white supremacy.
Sure. I
Okay,
mean,
right?
there's straight up
Okay,
black gun clubs.
right. But this was he wasn't black. It doesn't matter. It was about brown. It was
Right. Right.
broader,
Racialized.
racialized, but he was trained that he needed to remain armed at all times because the cops wanted him dead and white society wanted him dead. So here's the end of the story with this guy. He goes to pick up his kid at school. There's a dispute. He's divorced. There's a dispute at the school as to over which parent is going to take the kid home. I may have told the
Right.
story before.
I haven't
And
heard it.
yeah, and so he is told, no, this isn't your day for custody. You need to go home. I'm sorry, we called you. He was called in by the school and then sent
He draws
away.
his gun.
As he's leaving, the security is trying to he doesn't want to leave. The security is escorting him to the door. As he's leaving, his daughter turns the corner and he turns to her to tell her to come to him. A cop, who's one of the security people, is actually a police officer, pushes him towards the door and out the door. And then he pulls his gun and takes a shot at the cop, misses. And the shot kills him dead, point blank range, right in the head in front of his daughter. So that's the story I think of when I think about how this left relates to guns and then on campus, the left on campus was like, this is a kid who's a victim of white supremacy and police violence, right? Rather than we set this kid up for suicide by cop. And
he had a kid. Let's call him a man.
Okay, sorry. It was a friend of my kid, so I think of him as a kid, but he was probably about 26, 27. Yeah, so.
Right. I mean, obviously, it's a very, we just, people talk about it in terms of like the febrile atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there is, obviously, like they're just things that I almost feel like they're common sense, but they're not. I got them from I don't know how I would characterize my father's politics, but I would definitely characterize them as independent. He thought, on the whole, look, there's state, authorized killers.
Mm-hmm.
They're cops, and they have, in some sense, a license to use force that you have to be wary of. So he and I was a troubled young man. I got into a lot of trouble. I encountered police officers. My father, before that ever happened, foreseeing that possibility, he told me things like, you don't argue with the police,
Mm-hmm.
right? You can't assert your rights in the face of one of these agents of the state. Your rights aren't going to mean anything until you get into a court. He
Well, they
told
mean
me,
something once you're in the police cell, to like once you're arrested in the.
but you can't assert it.
You can ask for a lawyer.
You can ask for a lawyer, but they may or may,
right.
They could try to continue questioning you. They could act like they didn't hear it, right? Mm-hmm. You may have to repeat yourself.
Better call Saul. Better call Saul. That's all I say. But yes, right.
And,
yeah.
And so, I feel like, we live in an environment now where people argue with the police. They do. It happens all the time. And it leads to tragic outcomes. The mm-hmm. internet is full of these cases.
Yeah.
Where what used to be common sense from my basically middle class Ivy League educated father, he knew it. Surely Black people used to know this. Poor people used to know this. People who had were dissenters in whatever way used to know this. And people also used to have an attitude of solidarity with people who weren't in the government.
Right.
If someone said, look, I'm doing my job. I'm sorry you're having this dispute with your wife. But based on the information I have here, I can't release your daughter to your custody. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And, you appeal to them like a reasonable person, and you say, well, this is really inconvenient and whatever. You don't lose your mind, right? And you don't have a siege mentality, and you understand that you're dealing with people of goodwill, Black, white, Asian, whatever, that you can appeal to people as, fellow human beings, fellow members of society, certainly fellow workers. That I don't understand people who have difficulty talking to working class people, right? Mm-hmm. It's the easiest conversation in the world to talk about, your solidarity with working people, mm-hmm. right? Just whatever, they're tired, they're at the end of their shift, you can remark upon it. Mm-hmm. They'll be like, oh yeah, and they'll appreciate the fact that you've had an interaction. Mm-hmm. It's these things are so they're so subtle as far as the fabric of society is concerned, mm-hmm. right? And ultimately, of course, the reason why there's this breakdown is because we have we don't see the force of independent civil social organizing in society, right? We don't see the reality of that. Not even in spaces like church, right? I mean, historians talk about this when they talk about the lead up to the Civil War, right? That churches became divided on the slavery question, right? That congregations across America, like the Methodists or some national or, of course, ultimately international church organization. Methodism, of course, had an international dimension, going to England and the British Isles generally. All of these, they break down right? And I went with my mother to her Wednesday night church social,
Mm-hmm.
right? She's 84 years old, right? She goes to the Wednesday night church social. And the preacher got up and he gave a little like history lesson about the history of her Protestant sect. And it was all about how they'd always been in favor of the separation of church and state, even before the revolution. And how, you know, they had avoided the split over slavery and so forth. And my mom was like, well, that was interesting, but I don't know why he was saying that. And I'm like, Mom, it's because he's trying to tell the congregation he's not going to adjudicate the 2020 election from the pulpit, that he actually wants to minister to people without this political divide. Because we're doing the religion thing over here. We're not doing the politics thing here. You know, we're whatever. Right. This is about Jesus over here or whatever. And so I think that, you know, institutions don't have the character that they used to have. And, you know, I don't think that the Democrats are any less like responsible for this. I think they're more responsible for it. I mean, I think there is something to when the Republicans say, like, you're creating an uncivil political environment. You know, when, you know, I know there's cancel culture on both sides, and I know that there's lunacy on both sides. You know, and obviously, you know, there are. You know, this is what you were talking about. You know, people trying to adjudicate like who engages in political violence more. You know, but there's no doubt that the Democrats are fully involved in it. You know, fully involved in demonizing their political opponents. And of course, immense amounts of mystification are involved in acting like their political opponents are so very different. But, you know, they're, of course, all managing capitalism. But I think that, you know, this is, you know, we're in uncharted water. I mean, there is a crisis, Doug, that feels very dark, especially for you and for me, and, you know, trying to talk about the left and trying to educate young people. You know, like when I was learning, you know, when I first read Marx, you know, obviously the Soviet Union existed, you know, and it felt a little edgy, shall we say. You know, like this is the other guy, you know, the other team's guy.
Right.
But not really. You know, and certainly all my professors and everyone, you know, that I respected, they, you know, intellectually, you know, authorized it. You know, they were like, oh, of course, you know, you have to read this. Like, it's a very good thing that you're reading this.
Yeah.
You know, make of it what you will. You know, I think now, you know, Chris talks about this, you know, the alternative facts. Like, you can't talk about certain things without people assuming that you're a liberal or assuming that you're a Trumpy or whatever. You know, like if you talk on, you know, I don't know, the classic would be black on black crime. It's kind of a dumb category.
It is.
But, you know, gang crime or inner city crime.
Yeah, or just, yeah.
You know,
right.
Urban crime.
And there's not, by the way, gang crime is not at all limited to black people. There are Italian gangs. I remember I heard about them. There are Puerto Rican gangs. There are neo-Nazi white supremacist gangs.
Right.
You know?
You know, but on the south side of Chicago, they're mainly black. And, you know, they're killing each other. They're engaged in turf wars and whatever. And, you know, a kind of honor killing, kind of a tit for tat, you know, Hatfield and McCoy kind of dynamic. And, you know, can we really not talk about that? Is that really a conservative point?
Well, this is the thing. When I wanted to say this earlier, but this is
because you're talking about the degradation of social conditions in the inner cities of America.
Right. I mean, the thing is that, the campaign talks about putting its Marxism in its back pocket, um,
Hmm.
this being a pre-political moment. And what does that mean? It means right now, I think one thing it might mean is anytime you try to couch your activity politically, like and let your politics limit your thinking, you are serving capitalist politics. And what we have to do is strive for independence, which means being on the side of society overall, rather than being on the side of either political party or tendency or culture. We just can't do that. And anytime a giveaway is whether or not you're dealing with a socialist or not, I think, is whether or not how seriously they take the culture of either party, the framework of today's contemporary politics, which does tend to be expressed culturally, and we can't be trapped by that. And right now, it's going to be even more difficult because people who call themselves leftists are going to have their organizations investigated. They're going to be facing repression from the FBI. They're already people are call themselves leftists are losing their jobs, and we have to be clear as to who we align with is all of society, and with bourgeois norms and values in this.
And this is where the left, like talking about like, or what passes for the left, like claiming that there's some big benefit, to the Bernie Sanders moment because people started using the socialism word again, or it somehow, laundered the socialist banner.
Oh God.
Yeah, again, it's like, yeah, but no, not when you're talking about this, right?
No, socialism is now associated with fascism in people's minds and it's stigmatized all over again. And when we
Right,
talk about socialists, they just mean Democrats
right.
now.
And the Democrats, of course, who are most willing to degrade the political debate. The
Right.
Democrats who are most willing to say, you're not wrong, but you're a bad person. Right.
Mm-hmm.
The people who are most willing to say that, obviously, like, something like Jacobin, I think, tried to navigate this line. But when you look at the wider culture of the DSA and certainly the Nation magazine that Bosker's involved in, right, the idea that they weren't, or obviously AOC, right, AOC and Sanders both wanted to be the best critics of the Trump administration, right, the most vociferous, the most best in the sense of the Democrats, most uncompromising as they understand it. And so, the fact of the matter is that the socialists are trying to round up. How much did they say? Like, look, the rights of January 6th, of the accused in the January 6th trials are being abridged. We're interested in due process of law. They did not. They did not do these things. They did not talk about how right-wing people were having their people who were protesting abortion clinics, Catholics who were opposing abortion clinics were having their rights suspended or abridged. They were not defending that at all. They weren't acting independently. And so socialism just means Democrat, and the worst kind, the ones who are going to tell you about misinformation and the need to, crack down on it. They were all in on the COVID restrictions, lockdowns. Right. Yeah, sorry, I'm going on and on.
Yeah, no. I totally agree with you. Listen, what we now, I think we should wrap it up here and have another session, because what I want to talk about next is this moment as a post-Marxist moment. Not meaning you have to embrace post-Marxism, the ideology, but what does it mean that Marxism is on the decline? That the Marxists of 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago are no longer as interested in Marxism, it seems. And why? And why is that? I think that has two sides to it. On the one hand, I think that's like a necessary move. Like we actually have to be less Marxist now. And then on the other hand, it's a terrible danger. So we can talk about that in the second half if you still have time.
Yeah. And
right.
especially like the decline of Marxism on the left, amongst the neo-Stalinists and the neo-social democrats, what passes as the left today.
Yeah. All right. Let's leave it there.